Hello everybody and welcome back. Today I just want to talk about the first of the few Brave weapons that I want to make some videos on, and today we're going to be looking at the Recluse. Now the Recluse has come back in the Brave arsenal in Destiny 2, and it was a long-time favorite primary weapon for a lot of people. So is it still as good, or has it really been crept out of the meta by other options? Well, let's look at a few different roles of Recluse and to see really what the new version's able to do. For the few roles I want to look at in this video, there are several. First, I want to look at one that's got Threat Detector Surrounded, one that's got Enlightened Action Frenzy, then another Recluse that has Repulsor Brace and Frenzy. You may be wondering why there's nothing here that is Master of Arms, and in case you didn't know, it's basically because old Master of Arms is pretty much dead in the new update. It actually has been for quite a while. You see, part of why Recluse back in the day was so strong was because Master of Arms actually had not just a damage buff, but also affected the way that Recluse's crit damage was applied. It basically made your body shots do almost the same amount of damage as crits, so it essentially made it where Recluse didn't need to hit headshots in order to do full damage, which made it a very strong, very easy weapon to use. Master of Arms now is really just a 15% damage buff, which is, if you didn't know, actually the same amount as Frenzy, and Master of Arms therefore just ends up being kind of like the same damage as Frenzy without any of the stat buffs. It's really similar actually to how the perk Harmony works, and I mean Harmony's been in the game for a while and nobody uses it, so it's really not going to be the play on Recluse. I think Master of Arms is just one of the much weaker options that Recluse has, and if you really want that 15% damage buff, I would recommend just getting Frenzy, since it is so easy to activate in PvE and gives you so many stats in addition to 15% damage. So to get that out of the way, we can start by looking at a more basic role in this case, which is just going to be Enlightened Action Frenzy. You see, Enlightened Action is actually a pretty decent reload perk, and this is one of the first automatic weapons in the game that it can roll on. You essentially get a small bonus to your reload speed and your handling for every hit that you get, stacking up to 12 times, which on a 900 RPM SMG is pretty easy to keep going pretty much all the time. So I do kind of like Enlightened Action here. It's not necessarily the absolute best, but it is pretty interesting given that it's pretty unique on this weapon, and in playing with this role I felt like it was pretty good. Now, you are pretty much maxing out the reload speed whenever Frenzy is up, but Enlightened Action does help with some other stats, and it just makes the gun feel overall like kind of a stat stick weapon where the stats are super juiced with all these in combination and you're pretty much good to go, although you can get that same kind of stat feeling with a couple other roles like Threat Detector Surrounded. Enlightened Action Frenzy does have the bonus that unlike Threat Surrounded, it is very effective at any range, whereas Threat Surrounded kind of requires enemies to be near you, and Enlightened Frenzy will be able to essentially have its same performance at all effective ranges for this weapon. Now, for the second role, and my personal favorite of the bunch, we're going to look at Threat Detector and Surrounded. See, Surrounded is one of the best damage perks in Destiny, and if you didn't know, these Recluses that you're getting from Onslaught in the Brave Arsenal will actually be enhanceable in the Enclave once Final Shape releases in June. That'll basically mean that your Surrounded damage perk, which is already a 35% damage buff when you have 3 or more enemies within 8 meters, turns into a whopping 47% damage increase just for having 3 or more enemies nearby, which is really good for something that can be active basically for free. Now, the only problem with Surrounded that I can see some people having is that it is an all or nothing kind of perk. You either have 3 enemies within 8 meters and have the free almost 50% damage buff, or you don't, and so you do base damage, as opposed to something like Frenzy, which is really pretty much always up once it starts, since, you know, all you have to do is stay in combat, and then on top of that, will stay up as long as you're in combat, and there's not really a condition that will cause it to drop off other than being out of combat for several seconds. That's the one thing I can see going wrong with the Surrounded role, but I do personally really like Surrounded, especially its enhanced variant, and so I felt like I needed to mention it here because it is one of my favorite damage perks, especially on something like an SMG. Well, from there, I have one more role for Recluse I want to look at, and this one is a bit more tailored towards a Void build specifically, and it's Repulsor Brace Frenzy. See, since Frenzy gives you a reload buff in addition to a damage buff, you can kind of get away with having a really utility-focused perk on the other column and not really feeling like you're missing much. In this case, you'll have Repulsor Brace giving you a free Void Overshield anytime you get a kill on a target that has been Void debuffed, which is really, really good, especially for something like a Gear Falcon's Hunter, which is able to pretty much always have Void debuffs out, or even something like a Void Warlock if you want to play that, because you can pretty much always have Void debuffs on. Same with something like a Controlled Demolition Titan, you're pretty much able to have Volatile and then use that to get your Overshield, which does give a little bit more survivability to the weapon. I do quite like this role. It's a little more utility focused and does build much closer into the Void aspect of the weapon as opposed to the others, which I think are better for just general use. They don't necessarily require you to be on a Void build, even though they would work very well with one. They just work very well in general if you want to run Recluse. Another role you could do here is something like Repulsor Brace Destabilizing rounds, which I do think is pretty good. I did play with one a little bit when I was considering things for this video. However, it wasn't my necessary favorite. I felt like I got a lot more out of having Frenzy and then using my subclass to get my Repulsor Brace activated, mostly because if I was going to run something with Repulsor Brace, I felt like I was going to do it on a Void subclass anyway, and with those having access to Devour, it's very easy to keep your grenades up. All things kind of pointed me towards the general direction of Repulsor Brace Frenzy instead of Repulsor Brace Destabilizing rounds, but I feel like that could just be a bit more personal preference than it is necessarily the role being straight up better, but I felt like the 15% damage buff and the stat buffs from Frenzy were more welcome than having Destabilizing rounds on this weapon. Hey everybody, I'm back just with a little edit after having recorded and tested a bunch of stuff. I did leave out Desperate Measures in this video, mostly because I did not have a good role with Desperate Measures at the time in order to kind of play test with. But I think Desperate Measures is also an okay choice for a damage perk if you like it. It's basically just 10% damage buff when you get a weapon kill, and then you can stack that up to 30% using an ability, so you can basically get Golden Tricorn but a little weaker, but unlike Golden Tricorn, you can refresh it with a weapon kill. It's not my favorite perk for this gun, but it's definitely a good option if you like something like that. I still think I like Frenzy a bit more though. Now, at the same time, I do think it is worth comparing the Recluse to a few other weapons that have really similar perks and just other Void SMGs in general. And the first one I think is going to be the most obvious is Funnelweb, given that when Funnelweb was introduced back in Witch Queen, it gained a lot of comparisons to Recluse at the time. And yeah, I do think pretty definitively Recluse is stronger than Funnelweb. The overall weapon stats are a little higher, the perks in general I feel are a little bit better, just things like that. It just feels like a nice quality of life improvement over Funnelweb, but not necessarily some miles ahead improvement. They are actually very, very similar weapons. But given that Recluse is target farmable with the weapon attunement and such, I do think you're better off at this point in time trying to get Recluse instead of Funnelweb if you don't have either, or you would rather have Recluse and you're essentially at the point where you can be picky with your perks. But then there's a couple others I'd like to compare it to, mostly the 720 RPM SMGs, kind of both at the same time, Unforgiven from Duality and the Title, which is only available from Guardian games, so Title kind of gets left out a little bit, given it's only available for a couple weeks out of the year. But the Title is still pretty good, so I think I should mention it. We'll kind of lump the Title and Unforgiven together since they kind of perform similar ways. I think Unforgiven, personally for me, I still think is a little stronger than the new Recluse, at least at this point before Recluse has access to enhanced perks. Mostly because I've been running an Unforgiven with Demolitionist and Frenzy on it for a very, very long time now. Basically, since Unforgiven was put into the game, I farmed for one and got that role, and I've absolutely loved it. It just feels really, really fantastic. I don't know, there's something to me, at least, about 720 RPM SMGs that, for my personal preference, puts them kind of above the 900s. They just feel like they hit harder, especially in something more like Legend content, using an aggressive frame over a lightweight frame. It just kind of feels like you get more work done. But I don't necessarily think it's some crazy difference, and you could still definitely personal preference for Recluse over Unforgiven. I think, at least until Recluse has access to enhanced perks, I'm more likely to use Unforgiven or the Title over Recluse. And something that is worth noting is if you did get a Title with a similar role in Guardian games, those will also be enhanceable in the final shape, so Recluse will not be the only Void SMG that has access to enhanced perks. The Title will too, but it will be the only obtainable one that will, since the Title is only available during Guardian games specifically. And the last one I at least want to talk about is a little different, because I usually don't try to compare legendary weapons to exotics, since a lot of times exotic primaries tend to be pretty strong compared to their legendary counterparts, especially given that exotics get the 40% damage buff against just red bar enemies. But I think just given the buffs that it's gotten somewhat recently, the Manticore is somewhat worth comparing to Recluse, similar archetype, all that. And the thing is, if you are not going to be running an exotic kinetic weapon, or an exotic heavy weapon, then yeah, I think Manticore is just worth running over Recluse now since the buffs. It's really kind of a different case here, given that Manticore used to be so awful that it was not worth running over a legendary, just given how terrible the perk on it was. But now that it's been buffed quite a bit, I think it is worth it, especially towards like legend content, because for this video I tested most of these roles in Legend Onslaught specifically because, you know, any primary weapon is going to feel pretty cracked in like strikes or something, so I try to test with stuff like legend content. That's what Legend Onslaught is amazing for primary weapons. And the Manticore did definitely feel like it outperformed both Unforgiven, the title, and the Recluse. Just all of them kind of got washed by how strong the Manticore was, just getting that 40% buff. And again, like I said, it is an exotic, so it's not really fair to say, yeah, it's better, because obviously it's probably going to be significantly better. But if you are not already using your exotic weapon slot on something else, it is probably worth running Manticore over it. You'll get very, very similar performance, just given that it is a Void SMG that can do overshields similar to your Repulsor Brace Recluse, and you actually don't need to be on a Void subclass to get those overshields with Manticore, which is kind of interesting. So yeah, I do think Manticore is worth mentioning as a competitor to Recluse, given that it is a viable option now as opposed to before. Well, that's all I got for this video. So if you liked it, like and subscribe are greatly appreciated. I'll be streaming more on Twitch. Again, like I said, I'm going to be pretty much back from now to Final Shape, and then through there trying to get more content out. I've just been so busy over the last few months, in addition to Destiny being a little slow until recently, so I've not had as much time to make content and less things to make content about. But we'll be going through the Brave Arsenal weapons as we go. I think next I want to look at Edge Transit and then probably Falling Guillotine as well. I've already done some damage testing. It's just going to be a matter of writing and scripting the video and then recording and editing all of it. So if I manage to get that done, stay tuned for that. I'm very excited to look at Edge Transit compared to other heavy weapon options, and then also the Falling Guillotine compared to other sword options. So yeah, like I said, thank you for watching if you made it this far, and I will see y'all in the next one. Thank you.